Before I start the critique, I have to clarify some things. First of all, I have beaten the third act of the game and got all endings, and am now on my way to 100% the save file, so I am accustomed to the majority of game's content. Second, I am the get good guy typically, and I think overall the increased difficulty of Silksong is a welcome addition, but there are exceptions which I will get to. And lastly, despite the critique, I enjoyed the game immensely, and am now looking forward to DLCs and patches. Also, there will be minor spoilers. Now, let us begin. I will divide this into 6 categories for ease of digestion by the viewer, going from least to most problematic, and I will start with number 1. The equipment. I am actually pleasantly surprised with the way they handle tools and equipment, as instead of having to buy consumables every time, like you would in Dark Souls, you simply replenish them at each bench using shards, which is convenient and straightforward, and you only run out of them if you keep running to the boss and using them all, or are way too keen on using your tools during exploration. And the tools themselves are all useful and unique, so I have no real complaints here. Except for Rosary Cannon not working on keyboard, but that will be fixed soon, hopefully. As of the charms and trinkets, some are more useful than others, but they still have their place and uses, so here I do not have real complaints either. What I do have slight issues with is the crests. Letting you have different movesets is great, and I am all for it, and some of them are better suited for centered tasks than others, which is intended. But I still think you should be able to do everything with a crest, so you can go the entire game with one, if you really wanted to. And unfortunately, some crests are way too bad at certain tasks, so you have to swap them to get a good experience. Starting with the earliest crest you can get, the Beast Crest. The majority of the moveset is cool, and even the somewhat awkward lunge attack has its use due to large range, even though it takes half a second to wind up. But the down slash, oh boy, it makes any kind of parkour immensely more difficult, and while it functions too well on small enemies, due to the fact it burrows into the target, using it is a death sentence on anything big and flying, because you will exit the attack animation still inside the enemy and take damage guaranteed. Because of this, it is ill-advised on a good portion of the bosses. The Hunter Crest, being the default, is clearly what the devs intended the game to be played with, as you can go the entire game with it without any issues. The Reaper Crest is very convenient to use, and the extra range and wide attacks make it a great choice in areas with lots of parkour and air enemies, but it still does fine in other tasks. It's a solid crest and a good example of what the crests should be. The Wanderer Crest is a moveset from the first Hollow Knight. Convenient, but boring, so I didn't use it much, but it can be a good crutch for people who can't handle the new diagonal down slash. The Witch Crest is really cool and pleasant to use until you get to its bind, which I will leave for you to discover, but while awkward you can get used to it. What you can't get used to is the up slash. Due to it being diagonal at around 75 degrees, you can't hit anything that is directly above you, which is a problem completely unique to this crest. Another big problem due to being used to getting under the enemy to hit him with every other crest. This also screws with deflecting projectiles, so making the up attack wider to help with this would be much appreciated. The Architect Crest is slow but still solid crest after you get used to it, but the parkour with it can be awkward. It has a cool gimmick, and it's also the only crest with a good grade slash. Speaking of, for all the other crests, while it's not useless, you will not be using the grade slash often, so a buff for it with increased charge speed would be good. And then there's Shaman Crest, which has a cool gimmick of its own, but for some reason you can't bind in the air, and you fall down if you try, which is just poor design because some bosses and gauntlets literally do not have a floor to heal on. But overall, little complaints here. Moving on to number 2. The economy. Unlike Hollow Nest, with a pale king who treated his peasants well, in Farloom, the government, by the looks of it, was ran by bugs from under EA's floorboards. Because you have to pay for everything. Benches, bell stations, maps, there are even paid single-use benches and one paid door that closes every time. though you can break it to fix that. This is a solid lore point, but while I never had issues with running out of beads much, due to exploring a lot and stringing my rosaries often, for players who do not want to pay the 20 beads tax to string 60 rosaries, or who do not even know you can do that, and for players less prone to hitting walls and getting in every place where this light don't shine, I can totally see the frustration with not having enough money for other things. Thankfully, it seems Team Cherry will increase rosary drops and decrease the cost of some things, so that problem is going to be fixed. Some people might also have issues with running out of shards later on in the game, but you can buy shard bundles for rosaries if you keep running out for just 50 rosaries. And if you really need to farm, in the second chapter there's a vendor that sells trinkets that increase the drop rate of both rosaries and shards. So, not too much complaints here. The next point is benches and runbacks. What From Software already learned was not learned by Team Cherry. So quite often after death, because you did not find the bench for the area, or could not afford to use it, or because there's literally no bench nearby, after death you have to go back to your cocoon literally from a different area, sometimes 2 areas even. Which is frustrating, and considering the amount of dangers you are not guaranteed to even reach it. So you will lose all your hard-earned rosaries. Some areas have way too many benches, and some too little. If we take a look at the slab, it has 4 benches, which for a location this tiny is just excessive. But still welcome. However, if we take a look at the locations like Hunter's March, there's just 1 bench for the entirety of it. So because of it, every time you die, you have to do a pretty big run back, which is just frustrating. The more famous run back from the bench to the last judge is also a thing. While I personally do not have issues with it, for people slower than me and who struggle more with platforming, I can see why it would be very frustrating, because it's very easy to lose most of your health during the run back to the boss. And even worse location you unlock later on is Bilewater. I hate Bilewater. It has just 2 benches for the entire location, 3 after you beat the boss. And the bench from which you're supposed to run to the boss to is quite well hidden. So a good amount of time I had to spend running to the boss from the very beginning of the area, which takes a literal 5 minutes each time. And even after you find that bench, to save you the trouble, it's here by the way, you're welcome, it still takes around a minute to get back to the boss. And due to enemies and environment in the area, you often get there not in one piece and with maggots on you. So it's extremely frustrating even for someone as calm as I am. Because of this, I think Team Cherry needs to add benches closer to bosses and increase their amounts in areas such as Hunter's March, Bilewater, Blasted Steps, Deep Docks, Mount Fay, Underworks, and potentially other areas to make the game less frustrating. Speaking of frustrating, an entire point of its own, enemy gauntlets. For whatever reason, Team Cherry likes putting enemy gauntlets before bosses, and I think it's fair to say that nobody likes that, because it simply wastes your time. It's fine with bosses like Chef Lugoli, because it's just 2 enemies, but the Unraveled boss has 2 waves, and the goddamn Toad, Groll the Great, has 5 waves of enemies you have to fight every time before fighting him. Considering he's also in Bilewater, his encounter becomes immensely frustrating. On top of bosses having gauntlets, the map has them too, some which seem to drag a bit too long. But for the most part it's fine, except one. There is one room in the Citadel with a gauntlet, having Citadel bugs, which are not exactly easy, with freaking 10 waves of enemies! It's literally more difficult than some of the bosses, and while the run back to it is short, you have to do it from the beginning every time, and it's just really frustrating and weird because it's the only gauntlet in the second act like that, and in the game as a whole. Especially annoying is the last wave, where you get 2 enemies that overlap their attacks and make some of them impossible to dodge. So in the end, it just feels cheap and like bullshit. Devs honestly should remove the pre-boss gauntlets and remove that last wave of the Citadel gauntlet, because it is simply unfair and not fun to play against. And since we are on the topic of the unfun design, the bosses. The game has a lot of bosses which range from good to absolutely stellar. The Clockwork Dancers, the Phantom, the Lace Fights, the Widow, the Last Judge. There's a lot of very good and enjoyable fights. Even if some of them are difficult, they still feel rewarding and fun to try. But there are a couple exceptions which soar the entire experience a lot. Primarily 3 bosses. First being the Savage Beastfly. On top of being random with its attacks starting place and having random movement which causes you to bump into it, and it bumping into you, it also spawns minions which just make the fight even more frustrating and random. And it has double damage both on attacks and contact damage, which is bullshit. While you can kill some of the minions with the Beastfly itself, it's not always possible, and at that point in the game you do not have the damage to kill the summons or the boss itself quickly. So the fight is just long, tedious and random. And as a cherry on top of that shit pile, the run back is rather long and annoying. Then there's the Unravel. A boss with a gauntlet before the boss, and between phases. It also is completely immune to downslash, so you can't have fun with acrobatics. It has tons of health which just drag out the fight. It has a grand total of 2 attacks in the first phase, which is boring, but both of them are annoying because one is random and has no clear way of dodging it, and the other is just a ram. But because of how giant the boss is, you sometimes literally do not have enough jump speed to get over him. Also, the hitbox is not a square, so you often land on its tail when going down to try and do some damage after a ram. So yeah, very annoying and time consuming boss. At least the run back is without enemies. And the worst boss being Groll the Grey. Not even so much for the boss itself, but for the despicable arena with a maggot pit, which makes it very difficult to do consistent damage due to boss flying, the longest gauntlet before the boss in the game, a terrible run back to the boss, temporary minion summoning during the boss fight, and poor telegraphing on some of the attacks along with random air movement, which causes contact damage often. Absolutely horrible experience. I hope this toad dies of balls cancer. Additionally, I feel like some bosses could use some more clear telegraphing along with enemies, because having to guess the next attack is really bad, and guessing wrong is often the difference between life or death when everything does 2 masks of damage. Oh yeah, speaking of that, the damage. When designing the game, it genuinely feels like the devs expect the players to be the people who did Pantheon's Hitless in original Hollow Knight while playing with their butt cheeks. Because it's harder to find what does 1 mask of damage than 2. And that says a lot considering we do not have more masks than in the first game. Don't get me wrong, I like the increased difficulty, because original Hollow Knight felt too easy for my taste. But double damage on majority of attacks, even environment, means that your starting 5 masks of HP are practically 3, and you heal enough to withstand just 1 more hit. And that can feel way too punishing for getting into areas you have not been before. In original Hollow Knight, the game was forgiving enough that you could get used to the enemies while going through the area. In Silksong, with this much damage and very short immunity frames, you are practically guaranteed to die a dozen times to regular enemies before you learn them and can progress. Which just means that instead of being excited to explore the area, you are constantly tense because even a tiny flea can jump you with 2 damage and kill you. It keeps you constantly tense and stressed. And when you get to the bench, you are not happy for finding it. The thing on your mind is, thank God it's over, now I don't have to run as fair when I die. It's not excitement, it's relief after stress, and that is not very good. Pair that with needing to run to bosses through enemies and environments, which can sap most of your health by the time you get to the boss, and this can get very frustrating. My main proposal is that the amount of 2 damage attacks should be reduced and better telegraphed. And Hornet could use more masks by default, or better healing by default. Additionally, no enemy should ever deal 2 points of contact damage, cause a lot of them love falling and moving into you, not as part of their attack, which causes you to get confused and thrown off guard, which makes you run into another attack and die right there. Bigger immunity frames would also be appreciated, because getting comboed by enemies is very common, so you end up losing 4 to 6 masks of health in less than 2 seconds, which is just frustrating and feels very unfair. And the environment having 2 damage is also quite frustrating. It would not be as big of a deal if there were more silk along the way to use to heal, but that is rather rare, so you end up being scared to do each jump, because the cost of failure is potentially losing all your rosaries and having to run back for like 3 minutes. And then trying to do this whole section again. Good example of parkour sections in the game is the entirety of Mount Fae, very enjoyable. A bad one is Clockwork Core and Bilewood. God, I hate Bilewood. So as a conclusion, generally making the game more forgiving, less damaging, and better telegraphing the attacks of some enemies will be very appreciated. Then we add more benches, get rid of the pre-boss gauntlets, and do some slight tweaks and adjustments, and I think most people will be happy. If you have a different opinion, feel free to express it. Alright, bye.